So welcome again, everyone, to week 4 speaker session with Dr. Keir Finlow-Bates. Dr. Keir is a blockchain researcher. He is a prolific inventor with over 40 patents to his name. And he's the author of 2 books, Move Over Brokers, Here Comes the Blockchain, an educational, entertaining, and irreverent exploration of the significance of blockchain technology, and another book called Evil Tokenomics, an examination of how Web3 can be exploited by bad actors to scam the public. Although he is British, he lives in Finland for its gentle climate, low taxes, and cheap alcohol. So thank you so much, Dr. Keir, for joining us today. And today we'll be looking at NFTs, the Metaverse, and DeFi. So thank you all for joining. I'll just ask Dr. Keir to take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. So today I'm actually talking on Web3, Metaverse, and NFTs. So there's not going to be any DeFi.
Thank you.
It's okay. And I think there was meant to be a subtitle Beyond the Hype, but I also think that's probably been added to kind of jazz it up a bit, make it sound a little bit more exciting than it may well be. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by introducing myself, and I'm going to do that for 3 reasons. The first is to present my credentials, what actually allows me to be talking about this, and why I might well be somebody who's worth listening to. The second one, to be honest, is for self-promotion, right? I'm introducing myself in the hope that at the end of this talk, you remember me and you think, oh, I'll go and check out some other stuff that that guy has done. And the third reason I'll be telling you about near the end of this talk. And the reason why I'm saying that is that will keep you interested. So you might actually listen through to the end and think, I wonder what that third item was going to be all about. So that was kind of a meta introduction rather than an introduction, because I was talking about introducing myself. And so now I'll quickly talk about who I am. So I'm a former mathematician, got a degree from Cambridge in mathematics and information engineering, and a PhD from London South Bank University in mathematics and education. I entered the software industry in 1996, where I spent most of my time either as a test automation engineer or a test manager. And in 2015, my then employer laid off about 10% of the staff fairly randomly, and I found myself out of a job. But I'd been looking at Bitcoin in particular, but blockchain in general, since 2010, when I first read the seminal paper on blockchain by Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And so in 2016, I thought, well, do I want to go and look for more another permanent job? And I thought, well, given that permanent jobs don't seem to be very permanent, I'll just go freelance and I'll study blockchain. And that is what has led me here to be able to talk about Web3 and NFTs, and to also give an unusual perspective on the metaverse compared to what you'll probably see if you go and look out on the internet as to what's going on, what people are saying about it at the moment. So that's the introduction. And now I'm going to start talking a bit about blockchain, because it's the foundation to everything that I'm going to be talking about. And I have to add here that blockchain isn't necessarily the solution to the things that I'm talking about, which are going to be more general, but it is a solution, and therefore it gives us a way of pinning practical implementations to what I'm going to be talking about. And hopefully by the end, I'll have kind of tied Web3, the metaverse, and NFT together through the use of blockchain. So the first question is, well, what is a blockchain? And if you start looking at it from a technical perspective, which makes sense, given that it is a technical implementation, it's written in computer software, it runs on computers, then from a technical perspective, a blockchain is a really bad, slow, expensive database. And the reason why we still work with them is because blockchain is not solving a technical problem. If you look at databases, they do solve a technical problem. They solve how to store data on a computer in an efficient way and how to retrieve it quickly. Blockchains aren't about that. They are solving a social problem. And the social problem that they solve, well, over the last sort of 10 years or so, people have tried to characterize what is blockchain all about. And I've been one of them. And I've noticed that through the years, what we talk about has shifted over time. So people were talking about, it's immutable and it's transparent and it's trust building. And then other people say, oh, no, it's trustless. And what amazed me about it is that the depth of the problem that blockchain solves has resulted in the fact that it's become quite hard to describe what it really is all about. And my take at the moment is that a blockchain produces censorship-resistant ledgers. And that is quite significant because we are used to systems that are controlled by a particular entity, say a company that is running a server and a database, and that gives them complete control over how the system works, what can be done with the system. And we've kind of learned to live with that. And most of the time it's actually okay, but if you're unlucky, you may find yourself in a situation where you wish that the systems were a bit more decentralized and a little less authoritarian. And so when people talk about blockchain being all about decentralization, you have to think about what's the purpose behind that decentralization. Why? Decentralization for decentralization's sake becomes meaningless. But if you actually start looking at why, what motivates people to decentralize, then you start getting closer to the kind of core of the truth of the system. So I've said a blockchain basically provides a censorship-resistant ledger. And the reason why that is significant all comes down to ownership. Ownership is a concept that is probably innate in human beings because, well, I don't know about you, but I have a bunch of kids and they learn at a very early age to say the word mine. I mean, this is quite a tricky concept if you dig into it from a psychological and a philosophical perspective, but 2-year-old kids get it. They'll sit in the playroom playing, and then one of them wants the toy that the other one has and says mine, and the other one says no, mine. So if a 2-year-old can have a concept of owning something, then how hard can it be? Well, the answer is very hard because there are all sorts of layers to owning stuff. And the most obvious one is when you have a physical object. So, this is a bottle of water. I own it. It's in my possession. Now, I've used 2 words there, and you're already starting to see a division. I possess it. That means I have it. And I paid for it. So that means I own it. And we can have objects that we technically own, but they're not in our possession. For example, money in a bank account. The bank possesses your money and you own it. And that's all very well and good until, for whatever reason, the bank decides they're not going to give you access to your money, even though you own it, because they can do so. They possess it. So with a blockchain, we can build a decentralized ledger which doesn't have a centralized entity like a bank that owns the assets that are represented on the blockchain. They're actually controlled directly by you. And that means that the ownership is much more true and real than the ownership of money in a bank account. So, and an example of this is I went on holiday to Egypt once, and when I got there, my bank decided that I couldn't possibly be in Egypt because I live in Finland, and so they blocked my bank account. And although I had my money for my holiday to pay for sightseeing and souvenirs and stuff, I couldn't get it out. I couldn't use it. So even though I owned the money, I didn't possess it. And the bank in this case was trying to help me, protect me from potential fraud. But the practicality was that for the first week of my holiday, I couldn't buy anything, which turned out to be quite tricky. So if you've got your assets in a decentralized system where you control them, you won't face that problem. However, you do face a whole bunch of other problems, which is you become personally responsible for looking after what you own. So I mentioned censorship resistant, and I also mentioned the word ledger. And that's an interesting innovation that has been around since the ancient Sumerian times. So we're looking at about 4,000 or 5,000 years of history. The Sumerians used to write records of who owned what, jars of honey and bags of grain and things like that on clay tablets. And those clay tablets have survived. And we can actually go and look at these accounting records. So the ledger has a long history. And the great thing about a ledger is it allows you to record who owns what without that person actually having to have it in their possession. And that's particularly useful if the item that we're talking about cannot actually be possessed. So a very obvious example of this would be land. Land is very big. It's not like a gold coin or a bottle of water. You can't just stick it in your pocket and walk away. So if you want to have a record of who owns a piece of land, you need to have a ledger or a registry. So that's the kind of fundamentals to blockchain. You have this ledger that is a record of who owns what at this particular moment in time. And it's censorship resistant because it's not controlled by any individual entity or organization. We all maintain it together, and the little parts of it that belong to you can only be controlled by you until you pass on that ownership to somebody else. And it may seem kind of trivial when you first come across it, but a lot of the most significant inventions in human history, actually, when you look at them, are quite simple. And yeah, I can't believe I just said blockchain is simple, but the underlying concept really is. It just takes a lot of digging to get through to it. So what I'm going to talk about now is, well, what are we going to represent on this ledger? And what's it going to mean to us all? And I'm sure, given that you're all here in the talk, you've heard of cryptocurrencies. So those are fungible tokens. That means that one unit of a cryptocurrency is very much like the other. And you can therefore, if you're willing to accept them as payment, it doesn't really matter which one you get. In the same way that a dollar is a dollar. You don't really, it's very rare that somebody is given a $10 bill and then looks at it and says, well, actually, I don't like this one because the serial number doesn't look very nice to me. Unless they happen to know that that is a $10 bill that was stolen from a bank, or that serial number can't exist in this $10 bill is possibly a fraud. But generally speaking, people don't check their currency. When you get change, you just accept it because one unit of the currency is very much like the other. And that's fungible tokens. And as a result, we can use these tokens, or we can use the ledger of the blockchain to instantiate these tokens, and we can use these tokens for all sorts of purposes. And one of them is as a replacement for money. But another one is if you just step back and say, well, this counts as a sort of unit of accounting, a unit of measurement. And that means I can use it to represent lots of other things. For example, if I have a company and there are 1 million shares issued in that company, I can represent them as tokens. And then each token would allow its owner to have one vote in the company's annual general meeting for shareholders. But it doesn't really matter which of those tokens you get, because each token represents a vote. If you happen to get hold of 10, you get 10 votes. If you have 1,000, you get 1,000 votes. And you don't really care that you got the first lot issued or the second lot issued. They're all identical. So they're fungible. This leads me on to talking about non-fungible tokens. So non-fungible, that means that every token is different. They are not replaceable. And people use examples of things like art, that the Mona Lisa is non-fungible. You can't replace that painting with a picture by Picasso or Mondrian and say, well, they're equivalent. They may well have the same price at a given moment in time, but there are going to be people who prefer painting by Leonardo da Vinci, and there are going to be people who prefer a painting by Piet Mondrian or by Picasso. So they're not completely interchangeable. And on the blockchain, these tokens are also represented on a ledger. And the way that is done is that there is a table, and the first column in the table gives each token an identity. First one will be numbered token number 1, second one token number 2, and so on. And the second column of the ledger on the blockchain says who owns it. So we put the equivalent of bank account numbers in that second column, except that we use blockchain addresses instead. And again, if you're familiar with Bitcoin, well, there are Bitcoin addresses, and they function a bit like bank account numbers or debit card numbers. In Ethereum, they use Ethereum addresses. The addresses are constructed in a different way, but they perform the same purpose. And the purpose is to allow you to identify who owns a particular asset in the digital ledger. So if you've got this ledger with these 2 columns, and your address is in the second column against one of the tokens, what does that mean that you have? Well, it actually boils down to the fact that firstly, there's a record that says you own that token. And secondly, you're the only person who can transfer it to somebody else. But once you've transferred it, that's it. It's out of your hands. It's the person you transferred it to who now has control over where it goes next. So it does sometimes feel a little bit like a baton race where you're kind of passing the baton on to the next runner. And you think, well, what is the purpose of all of this? But ultimately, it's about having a record of who owns what at what time. And with non-fungible tokens, it just happens to be that there's a single unit, unique entry in the blockchain that represents the token, and it also contains information on who owns it. Now, in NFTs, typically they then add extra columns to the table. So there might be a third column that says, well, here's a URL, a hyperlink to a web page somewhere that will tell you a bit more about the token. And you can add as many columns as you like if you're writing your own NFT contract. Maybe you can come up with other things that you would like to record against the particular token. I can't think of anything significant off the top of my head, well, for example, you might want to keep a record of how many times it's been transferred, so that's actually stored against the token. Maybe you want to keep a record of exactly when it was created, actually inside the record of the token, rather than people having to go and dig around on the blockchain, things like that. But just as a database allows you to add fields to a database record, if you design your instantiation of the NFTs on the blockchain correctly, you can add extra information there too. So now we've got this concept of a censorship-resistant ledger. We've got this idea that we can represent assets digitally on it. These can be fungible or they can be non-fungible. And so we're going to put the blockchain stuff aside now and move on to talking about Web3. And then I will pull in the blockchain stuff that I talked about a bit later. And then again, when I finally get onto the metaverse. So Web3. Well, whenever you see something with a 3 on the end, it's probably worth looking at the 1 and the 2 as well. Watching Rocky 3 before you've seen Rocky 1 and Rocky 2 is going to spoil some of the plot, and it's not going to make as much sense. So I'm going to give a brief whirlwind tour of the history of the World Wide Web. I'm going to have to gloss over some of the specifics, so people will be able to go back and dig through this and say, well, what you said there wasn't quite right. But I hope you'll forgive me for trying to simplify things given the amount of time that we have today. So the World Wide Web, Part 1. Well, it was invented in 1989 by a guy called Tim Berners-Lee, who has since been knighted, and so he is Sir Tim. And the pieces that are used to build it, well, all that the bits and bobs already existed before, but this is not unusual when it comes to invention. Most of inventing is about taking previous ideas and putting them together in a new way with a bit of a twist, and then maybe there's 1, or if you're lucky, 2 or 3 extra innovative steps in there. But a surprising amount of invention actually is just a matter of taking the existing jigsaw pieces and putting them together in a different way to get a different picture. So for Web 1, what Sir Tim did is he came up with a couple of things. Firstly, a markup language. So that's a way of describing what a page should look like on a computer. So that's HTML. and a protocol for transferring that kind of information from a server to a client. That protocol is called HTTP, and that's why you see that in front of every web address if you're typing it in your browser. Although I think actually these days they hide it, but it's there. If you haven't seen it before, just keep an eye out for it. So that's kind of the back end technical side. On the front end, there's the idea of a web browser, which we're all familiar with now, and hidden away somewhere on the internet in an office or in a some kind of facility, a web server, which is a computer that actually sends out these web pages over the internet to the browsers. And this structures really was pretty static, not completely static, but most web servers in the early days, in the days of Web 1, had static pages on them, and you went and looked at them, and then you moved on and looked at another page. There was some to and fro. We had forms, so you could fill in data and send it back to the server. And there was something called CGI, the Common Gateway Interface, which allowed you to write scripts on your web server that did something akin to sort of some dynamic web stuff, but it was kind of pretty basic. And then the leap forward happened with Web 2, which kind of kicked off at the end of the 1990s. We had this idea of web frameworks, and in particular, the website now had a database at the back end. And the web pages were constructed by taking data out of the database, using the web page language to make it look nice, and then shipping it off to the browser. And people who are using the browser can type stuff in those web pages and get it sent back, and that is stored in the database. So that's quite a useful idea, because it means that you can then show the stuff that one person has had written to the database to another person. And that's basically how social media works. You're using a web page to write some stuff to a database, and then somebody else is using a web page to see what it was that you wrote. And then the second thing that really jumped to the forefront in Web 2 was the idea of user accounts. So if you wanted to use one of these services, like a Facebook or a Google or a Twitter, you have to sign up. You have to provide your name and email address, come up with a password, and the company that is running the service creates a user account for you in the database, and you need to have that to be able to use the service. Now, this is a problem, because if the company decides for whatever reason that they don't like you, it could be because you've broken their terms and conditions, but it can also be fairly arbitrary. Then they can decide to delete your account. And I read an article recently that this has happened to about 100 people in the Netherlands. Microsoft closed their Microsoft accounts and sent them an email saying your account has been terminated for breach of the terms and conditions, but they didn't even tell them what it was that they'd done wrong. And so these people lost all their photographs and files on OneDrive. They no longer had access to all their emails that used to be in their inbox. They couldn't access games on the Xbox that they paid for and that were linked to their account. And the only way to get all this stuff back from Microsoft is to take Microsoft to court, to say, look, you have to tell me what it is that I did wrong so that I can defend myself against your accusations. And then hopefully, if it turns out you made a mistake, or a judge thinks that your closure of my account is unjustified, then I get it back, and at least I can retrieve all my data. Now, this only happened to 100 people in the Netherlands, but of course, this is going on all the time with all sorts of Web 2 companies, and we as individuals have very little redress. Taking a big company like that to court is very time-consuming, very costly, and ultimately you might not win. So the fact that in Web 2 that your identity is not under your control is very, very significant. And now I'll talk a bit about Web 3, and then we'll go back to that point that I just made in a moment. So Web 3, well, it's a new term. There's a lot of discussion still going on about what it is. I personally start off by looking at it from a technical point of view and define it as Web 2, but also using a blockchain as a kind of a database. And that is, as far as I can tell, the simplest definition of Web 3. It's a website that is using a blockchain as a kind of database. So it's reading data from the blockchain, and it can't write the data directly to the blockchain, or well, it can technically speaking, but maybe it writes data to the blockchain, maybe it gets the user to write data to the blockchain. But in that sense, the website is drawing data from the blockchain that it's using to show you web pages. It's giving you transactions that it thinks you might want to submit. And when you submit them, then the web page can go back and see the result of those transactions too. So in that sense, for a developer, the blockchain looks like an awkward but perfectly functional database, maybe a little bit expensive to use, maybe a little bit slow, but it's a database. But for us as users, it becomes significantly different. And the reason for that is that in order to transact with a blockchain, you need a blockchain address. These are typically handled for us now in software known as blockchain wallets. So in Ethereum, a common one that is used is called MetaMask. And those wallets contain these unique addresses that just belong to you, the wallet owner or the wallet controller. And that means that Web3 can solve some of the identity problems that we have in Web2. Namely, instead of the identity being under the control of one of these centralized companies, you as the user of that internet are in control of your own identity. You have some kind of control over how what you can do that cannot actually be taken away from you. And the reason for this is due to the magic of something called asymmetric key cryptography, which I'm going to try and explain very briefly and very simply. With asymmetric key cryptography, you end up creating two things: a public key or a public address and a private key. And as the name suggests, the private key is something that you look after, you protect, you do not reveal to anybody else, because if that leaks out, then you're compromised. That's like your password being revealed on a Web2 website. The public key is something you show the world. And again, asymmetric key cryptography is not new. There was a guy called Phil Zimmermann in the 90s who released a program called PGP, or Pretty Good Privacy, which aimed to use asymmetric key cryptography to allow people to send each other encrypted emails so that snoops and governments can't look in on what it is that you're talking about, i.e. to protect your privacy. And it allowed people to prove they were who they were. Because if you have the private key, you can encrypt something that can then only be decrypted with the public key. And similarly, if anybody uses your public key to encrypt something, only you can decrypt it. So it allows, if I have a public-private key pair and I make my public key public to all of you, you can use it to encrypt data, like a message you want to send me, and send it to me, and only I can read it. So if it goes to the wrong person, they can't read it. And similarly, and this is the clever bit, I can use my private key to prove that I am who I am. So if I say I am the owner of this public key, you can say, well, prove it. And then I say, okay, give me a challenge. And you say, right, encrypt this list of 10 random vegetables that I have picked. And then I take my private key, I take your list of 10 random vegetables, I encrypt them with my private key, and I give you the encrypted result. And then you use my public key to check whether when you decrypt the gibberish that I've handed you, you get back the original list of 10 random vegetables that you selected. And if you do, then that means that I do indeed control that private key. And then if it comes to a blockchain, that means that I also control the assets on all those various ledgers, whether they are fungible tokens or NFTs that are assigned as being owned to the public key or the public address. And what's more, I can use this public address for logging on to Web3 websites. I go to the Web3 website, it says, who are you? I give them my blockchain address, which is kind of like a public key. They send me a challenge, like that list of vegetables that I mentioned. I encrypt it with my private key and send it back to the website. It then decrypts it and checks that it decrypts to the correct list of vegetables. And if it is, they say, hooray, you've logged on. So that replaces the whole idea of an email address as your username, a password that is being stored in the database, under the control of that company, and at some point is probably going to leak out onto the internet, because it always seems to. And then all sorts of other awkward things where you have to use two-factor authentication and your mobile phone to key in a one-time code that pops up every 30 seconds or whatever. That stuff goes out the window, and the best thing is you're in control of this. As long as you look after your private key, nobody can take away your identity. In comparison, of course, on Web 2, the company can just delete the record of your user account whenever they feel like it, and you're gone. You no longer exist on Google or Facebook or Twitter or on Microsoft services or whatever. So that's kind of the advantage of Web3 with identity. And then I really feel that I do have to talk about some of the risks with Web3. And that is that the website, although presenting a nice, familiar, understandable interface to the world of blockchain for us, is a presentation layer. So you are still looking at a centralized web server serving up this web page. It's just that the data that it's using is coming from a decentralized system, and therefore is not under control of the entity that is producing the web page. But what the company can do is, well, there are three things they can do that I can think of off the top of my head. The first one is they can lie to you. So they can retrieve data off the blockchain, but then serve you a web page that doesn't accurately represent what there is on the blockchain. Now, you can always go directly to the source and check it if you know how, but the whole idea of Web3 is that you don't have to, that you're presented with a much more usable interface. So they can go and look up and see, Keir only has 0.001 ETH. Well, we're going to present him with a page and tell him that he actually has 100 ETH. We're going to lie to him. The second thing they can do is they can trick you into making bad transactions. So a lot of Web3 websites give you an interface to make transactions on the blockchain. And one of the classic ones for this is NFTs. If you go to somewhere like OpenSea, you buy an NFT, then you decide you want to send it to a friend. Now, you can go and handcraft an Ethereum transaction to transfer that NFT from your address to another address. But it's a lot easier to go to a website like LooksRare OpenSea, and they will actually have a button there that says transfer it. And you can just click on it and you put the address that you want to send it to in there. It then creates the transaction for the transfer, sends it to your blockchain wallet, say MetaMask, and you just sign it, and then the transaction happens. But if they decide to swap out the address that you said you want to send the NFT to some other address, you would have to go and look inside the transaction. And again, most people won't bother. So that's the risk of being tricked into making bad transactions. And the third thing is that they can decide to ignore the meaning of the data that they get off the blockchain. So if you imagine you have a game and the game advertises very proudly that it is based on Web3 and blockchain technology, and that you have ownership of the assets that yourself, because they're NFTs on the blockchain. So if you get a sword in our game, you own that sword. We can't take it off you, which is all very well and good. But then you log into the game and you pull out what you think is going to be your sword, and it's a banana in the game. It's because the game is a presentation layer. The game decides how to interpret the meaning of the asset that it's retrieved from the blockchain. And the developer can just selectively say, well, I'm going to respect the NFTs that say they are swords in our sword game, except for this one person. And when they are using their NFT that represents a sword, I'm going to render it as a piece of fruit, and I'm not going to give them the damage and the strength that the asset is supposed to, because I'm going to censor them. I'm going to make life difficult for them. So this is why NFTs and blockchain are not going to be a fail-proof solution to problems that we have with games at the moment. The problem we have with games at the moment, like Fortnite and Minecraft and things like that, is that you don't actually own the things in the game. Your kids may play these games and they may amass a larger number of skins in Fortnite, say, or whatever. but they're under the control of the company. They're Web2 based, and they therefore don't truly own them. And the company can just decide to close their account and everything's gone. So Web3 would mean that they would still have the assets as on the blockchain, but the company can still ban them from going into the game. So Web3 will not solve that. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes there are people that you just don't want to allow to use a particular service because they are being obnoxious or actually engaging in illegal activity. But anyway, hopefully that's kind of gone through some stuff about Web3 now. And there was one final thing I want to say about identity, which is if you're creating your own identity, that's useful in a limited sense, like being able to create an account on a website that has a service that you like. It doesn't do very well when you expand it outward into the idea of being able to authenticate yourself in general. So I can't just go and create my own passport or my own driving license, for example. And one of the things that Web3 is not going to get rid of is the fact that there will occasionally be authorities who will make claims about you that you should not be making yourself. So, for example, you should not be allowed to drive just because you said, I'm good at driving. I've issued myself with a driving license. You'd need an authority to say, yes, Keir has passed the test and he's paid the fee, and we have issued him with a driving license. Similarly, degrees. You shouldn't just be able to say, I have a degree in economics. You would kind of defeat the whole purpose if people could just make false claims. So again, you want a university to be able to say, yes, it is actually true that this person completed the course, got the required grades, and we've given them the certificate. Now, one of the advantages of using a blockchain for your identity is that you could, as an educational institute, mint a token to represent the qualification that someone has received. And the reason why you can do that is because you're effectively just creating a ledger. So back to the early part of this talk where I was talking about ledgers. And in that ledger, you would just have your first column would be the identity of the degree, and the second one would be the identity of the person receiving it. And of course, because it's a degree, you shouldn't be able to transfer it onwards. Just because I've managed to get a qualification in mathematics doesn't mean I should be able to at some point in the future say, I don't need it anymore. I'm going to go and give it to my wife, then she can claim that she's a mathematician. It doesn't work that way. So there you have a third kind of token that can be transferred once to one person, but they can't transfer it on anymore. And you may have heard about these. They are called soul-bound tokens. And really, they're as simple as that. It's just a list saying, here's a person's address, and here's the thing that the claim that we're making about them. And you can't transfer it on. Usually, the certifying authority, like the university or the driving the car department of the government or whatever, might be able to wipe it out. Say, right, okay, we found out that he actually cheated on the exam, so we have to cancel his degree. Or he was caught driving under the influence, so we have to cancel his driving license. But what you can't do is transfer it onwards. So I'm looking at the time here, and I think I'm doing okay. I'll now move on to the final thing, which is the metaverse, which certainly doesn't exist at this moment in time. And I'm not sure if it ever will. And part of the problem is that when you think that defining Web3 is hard, defining the metaverse is much, much harder. I went online and checked, and here are 3 definitions that I found, the first 3 that popped up when I Googled them. So the metaverse is defined as a single shared, immersive, persistent 3D virtual space. That was the first one. That really trips off the tongue, doesn't it? The second one is a virtual reality space in which users can interact with a computer-generated environment and other users. And the third one said, persistent live digital universe offering individuals a sense of agency, social presence, and shared spatial awareness. Well, I don't happen to think they're very good. And the reason is this constant focus on 3D virtual reality world. And I've been saying this for about half a year now. So I was very pleased when the other week, Neil Stephenson said the same thing. So for those of you who don't know, Neil Stephenson is a science fiction writer. And in 1992, he published a book called Snow Crash, which contained within it the concept of something called the Metaverse, which was a 3D virtual world that allowed people to interact with each other. So the Metaverse comes from a science fiction novel. And in Neil Stephenson's book, the story is set in a dystopia. It's sort of a not too distant future America where everything is run by corporations and the whole country is not really a selection of states anymore. It's a selection of areas of land controlled by a company. So the funny thing is, despite the book being a dystopian vision of the future, a lot of technical people have since 1992 tried to build what Neil Stephenson described as a metaverse. And the issue here really is that it's talked about as being immersive, but you don't need something to be three-dimensional or VR for it to be immersive. If you've ever read a book and forgotten that you were there reading the book because you're so enthralled by the story, or if you've gone to a movie, which is just on a 2D screen, and watched it and forgotten yourself because you get wrapped up in the tale that is being told, or if you've browsed the web and been reading articles on Wikipedia and have been hopping from article to article until suddenly you look at your watch and realize you've spent 3 hours, and whereas you meant to go and look at how to get rid of aphids from a plant, you're now reading about how the Sanskrit language has an interesting grammar structure, for example. Those are all things that are immersive, and they are not three-dimensional virtual spaces generated by a headset. And Neil Stephenson agreed. He said when he wrote the book in 1992, he hadn't seen the game Doom, and that now seems like a perfectly good rendering of a 3D world through the window of a two-dimensional computer screen. So I don't know why the focus of the metaverse just seems to come back to 3D, but it does. So then I guess the question is, well, what do I think it's about? And I think the important things are that indeed it's a place where people can interact, which is kind of what we're doing here. Okay, you're not talking at me, but hopefully you'll ask some questions soon when I finish this. So it's the interactive part is important. There's this sense of agency that the third definition mentioned. So that's about being able to perceive and set goals and make changes to your environment. It's a term from psychology and philosophy. So again, a metaverse should be a world where you have a purpose. It may be to obtain information, it may be to socialize, it may be to show off psychological signaling, the equivalent of digital jewelry. But there's got to be a purpose. And then finally, there needs to be an economy. There needs to be a sense that people own stuff or people control certain parts of it in a way that other people don't. Very much the way that the real world works, right? You may own your own house, you may have the keys to your own car. If you can't afford a car, well, you can go and carve yourself your own walking stick, and it's yours and not somebody else's, you know, using a stick that you find in the forest. There's this sense that you are participating in an economy and you have a place in that economy and a purpose. So when I look at what I'm seeing happening in the in projects that label themselves as a metaverse, the problem I have with most of them is I'm just left with a sense of, well, why? What problem are you solving? What opportunity are you giving me? And most of the time, you don't really see an answer beyond a very surface level. I'm going to use it as a form of advertising. I'm going to build stuff in it, and then people can come and see it, and hopefully that'll stick in their minds. And then when they go to out into the real world, they'll remember and they'll buy something related to my brand, for example. And that's why I'm not surprised to see a lot of brands going into the metaverse, because they see it as a new form of advertising. But there should be so much more to it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap up by cheekily referencing a project that I work on myself, which is that I've built a 3D voxel world that's it's a Minecraft-like game, but Minecraft itself is based on earlier games as well. And it's solving one specific problem, which is that my kids love Minecraft. And they play it an awful lot, probably far too much. And they really like building stuff. So they love the creative mode rather than the survival. So they like building. and they like showing off their buildings to each other. But there's a problem. It's an absolute nightmare, because they also like sneaking into one of their brothers or sisters' builds with a load of dynamite and blowing it up. So, you know, my 9-year-old daughter spends 2 hours building a replica of the Taj Mahal, and then her 9-year-old twin brother destroys it in a matter of seconds. So I built this Authorverse with the idea being that it's a public shared Minecraft-like game, because my kids clearly like interacting with each other when they're not being vandalistic towards each other. But with one difference: you can own a patch of the land, and if you own it, you're the only person who can build on it. And that means that my kids can go in there and they can build their castles, they can show them off to each other, but they can't destroy the other person's work. So it's solving a very simple problem. And to be honest, the amount of work I put into it doesn't justify the end result, which is that the kids look at it and they think it's kind of fun, and then they go back to Minecraft anyway, because I don't have crafting tables and I don't have capes, apparently. And apparently these things are essential. But anyway, but it does prove a point, which is that you can create a world in which people can interact, but in which there is a sense that there are boundaries that one person is allowed to cross and the rest are not. In this case, it's you can build on the land if you own a token representing it, and everybody else can't. They can go and visit it, but they can't actually destroy it, which is kind of how the real world works again, right? If I have a car and my key to the car, it's mine to drive, and you're not allowed to unless I give you the keys. If I lend them to you, and hopefully you'll give them back. So that Authorverse example was just an example of, here is a problem, kids not getting along all the time in Minecraft. It's a bit of a trivial one, but to be honest, it actually has more focus and purpose than most of the metaverse stuff I see out there. But I think there are lots of other problems like that that need to be solved, and they need to be solved in a way that means there's not an arbitrator or a central authority that's making the decisions. Maybe there can be one that eventually you default to if there's a serious problem, the equivalent of having the courts. You know, the idea is that you solve your problems by trying to reason through them first. If eventually communication breaks down and everything becomes unreasonable, then you hire lawyers and you go and have a court case and you have your day in court. But the idea is that that's meant to be down the end of the line. And again, I think this is something that Web3, the metaverse, and tokens like NFTs can lead us towards, that maybe there is a last resort, but 99% of the time we're resolving it ourselves. And ultimately, you are the captain of your own destiny, and you actually genuinely have control over your life in this new digital world, even if you don't have much control over the actions of the other people around you. So I'm just going to throw in one final word: interoperability. That's the other thing that's missing in the metaverse, which is that you're meant to be able to take your stuff from one subsection of the metaverse, so let's call it a subverse, and use it somewhere else if you want to. Well, I'm not seeing very much of that either, although I am proud to say that if you create an avatar skin in the Authorverse, you can use it in Minecraft. So that is the second feature that my little project has interoperability that I don't really see anywhere else. But ultimately, if the assets are instantiated on a blockchain that is transparent, that is public, then there is the option for them to be used elsewhere. Of course, then it is a choice of each individual project whether they actually do. And I think in the short term, it's unlikely that we're going to see much in the way of that. I think in the longer term, when some projects get more visibility and more popularity, then their assets will become significant, and people will want to use them just to be associated with the success of that particular project. But that's just speculation. Anyway, so and I didn't really describe the callback to the third missing thing. The third one was about the identity part that I was talking to in the middle, and particularly about making claims about yourself. They need to be backed up by an authority. So I'm sorry I didn't mention that in the middle, but I managed to touch on it in the end, just to make sure you don't go away and think, oh, they never did really talk about that third thing. So that's my talk on Web3, the Metaverse and NFTs. And I have another 11 minutes before I have to go off and cook dinner for my kids. So that gives us scope for a few questions, if there are any, and if they are allowed.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I'm sure everyone got a lot of value and a lot of knowledge nuggets about the way Web3, Metaverse, and blockchain works. And I see there's someone who's raised their hand. So Ganesh, I'm unmuting you. So go for it and ask your question.
Hi, I have a question on DeFi. The very objective of DeFi is to remove the middleman.
Mm-hmm.
But in the process, what I see that DeFi itself, the DeFis are themselves are becoming middlemen. So is it not contradicting the very purpose of DeFi?
Right, yeah, so you're right. If you take something like a token swapping contract like Uniswap, where you might want to trade some ether for some mana for Decentraland, or some sand for Sandbox, or some DAI because you want to have it in dollars and you don't want the ether to, you don't want to take the deal with the volatility of the cryptocurrency that you're holding, then yes, they charge a commission, a small percentage for you to use their service. And the difference with a DeFi protocol and using an exchange is that, firstly, the DeFi protocol can't censor you. So as long as you have ether and want to swap it into DAI, say, you can conduct that transaction. The smart contract can't say, no, I don't like you. You have the wrong political beliefs, or you follow the wrong religion, or
Here you're muted.
Sorry. How long was I talking? I don't know why that happened.
Just for the last, I think, like 30 seconds, more or less.
Okay. Well, anyway, let me say it really quickly then. So, yes, there is a commission charged by DeFi protocols in order for you to participate, interact with them. But the fact is that they are censorship resistant. If you want to change your token A into token B, you can do it, and the rest of the world can't stop you, as long as the protocol doesn't have any backdoors that allows it to be frozen, or that allows it to specifically ban certain addresses. Whereas if you take conventional currency exchanges, you can be censored. So here an example is countries that allow tourists to convert their currency into the local currency, but will not convert the local currency back to the tourist's original currency. So you have to spend it all, or where they say you're not allowed to take more than a certain amount out of the country. So when you have a centralized financial protocol, you are still at the whim, or you're at the whim of the entity in charge of that system. And if the exchange says we don't deal with people like you, then you have no recourse. But with a DeFi protocol, it doesn't care. It's like, as long as you submit a transaction that is valid and you have the assets to back it up, it'll execute it. And yes, it does charge a small fee, but you know exactly what it's going to do. It's not going to turn around and say, no, this week we're not allowing that.
Thank you very much for your answer. And if you guys want to open up your microphones, just feel free to raise your hand so that we can unmute you. And otherwise, I will move on with other questions that are in the chat. So Abubakar is asking, what are advantages of NFTs over using 3D?
I don't really understand that question. What are the advantages of NFTs over using 3D?
So maybe Abubakar, if you could clarify your question in the chat, or just open up your microphone if you want. Otherwise, we can move on to Alex's question. What is your opinion about purchasing land in the metaverse today, such as Decentraland?
Okay, so I'm probably required at this point to say that I am not the person you should turn to for financial advice, because I'm not a qualified professional, and you should do your own research. I mean, the two big projects, but I'm going to go and give an opinion anyway. So the two big projects are Sandbox and Decentraland. You've probably read that there aren't really very many people in them, and that the valuations of billions of dollars for these companies don't therefore really make sense in a conventional manner, when you're supposed to have millions of users before you get those kind of valuations. I think it's really risky. The NFT, the only company that is interested in showing you something based on that NFT is the company that minted it. So I don't see any projects where they go, let's allow use. I'm not anything to do with Sandbox, or I'm not anything to do with Decentraland, but let's build something where Decentraland token holders get extra rights that other people don't have. I don't see that kind of stuff happening at the moment. And I don't really see it happening in the future either. Why would somebody want to give them that special status? The prices have changed immensely. I don't own a decentralized token myself. My company does have a Sandbox one. We bought it for research. We haven't found it any use. I really, maybe they're going to turn around and do something amazing with the money that they've managed to raise from selling all these tokens. On the other hand, it could go the way of a lot of these projects where nothing is achieved, and ultimately it's a sort of bit of a damp squib. But so yeah, I can't really give you any advice on buying one, but I'm skeptical of projects at the moment, but who knows?
Who knows? Okay. Right. We have a couple more questions in the chat. So Fabian is asking, asymmetric key cryptography. Why are not we using this to solve sending money to the wrong account on the blockchain? Should it work in theory?
Well, we do use asymmetric key cryptography to send money on the blockchain. And the reason why I'm trying to work out, to solve accidentally sending it to the wrong place. So this is like it's like me sending money using my bank account, but I accidentally typed their bank account in wrongly. And so instead of going to whoever I meant to send the money to, the money goes to some random other person. And then you are supposed to be able to go to the bank and say, I made a mistake. Can you please cancel that transaction? And they will. Now, it's not always guaranteed, actually. There are a number of cases that I've read about where people have accidentally, there's a one with Barclays recently where the guy sold his house and the money was wired to another person with the same name. And it took him nearly 4 years to get Barclays to actually get him his money. And that was only when the newspapers started getting involved and publicizing it. So kind of reversing transactions works most of the time in the traditional financial world. It doesn't work all the time. It doesn't work at all on blockchain. And the reason is that you're not meant to be reversible. It's not meant to be reversible. Otherwise, you'd be in a situation where you could defraud people, because you would send them the Bitcoin or the Ether or whatever. They would send you the goods, and then once you receive the goods, you'd cancel the transaction. And especially if you've been doing this anonymously, well, then they have no recourse. They can't even track you down in real life. So the whole idea is that it can't be reversed. The flip side of this is indeed that you end up with people sending it to the wrong account and the money's gone. And I think that's partially a usability problem, that the interfaces for using the system need to be improved. And there, for example, for big transactions, maybe there needs to be a cooling off period where you tell your wallet you want to make this transfer, and then gives you maybe 10 minutes to a day to think about it before it actually executes it. Something like that. I think some of the people are working on stuff like that. Yeah, it's it's the way it is for a reason.
Thank you. And now is the last question before we leave for today. So someone asked, does Metaverse need a blockchain to survive? How does it matter to the user if blockchain is not used as a platform to support any Metaverse?
Right. So yeah, if you just want to build an immersive 3D world in which multiple people can interact with each other, then you don't need a blockchain. Because what you're building is a game, like Second Life or Fortnite or Roblox or whatever. If you want to build a world in which people are independent agents who go about conducting economic business, then you need something like a blockchain, because if you don't have that, then the company that is providing the 3D virtual space for you to interact with people and is providing the means for you to transact with them is ultimately in control of everything. They have effectively godlike powers. So you're looking at something like World of Warcraft, where you do have a currency, gold coins, and you can engage in economic activity, but ultimately the company can take it all away from you if they decide that you've violated the terms and conditions. And you may not even have done so, and you may not even have the opportunity to defend yourself. Now, with a metaverse with the assets all represented on a blockchain, you will always continue to own them. And even if you can't get into the particular corner of the metaverse where you would meet people and be able to use those assets, what you can do is go out of band and trade them somewhere else. Even if it involves building that trading place yourself, you will have the opportunity. And I didn't talk about this in the talk because there's only so much I can cover, but they're called secondary marketplaces, right? Which is that when you have the assets represented on a blockchain, it allows other people to set up places where you can then trade them. So you don't have to rely on the original issuer of the asset to allow you to continue trading it. You can go somewhere else, get a better deal, avoid being locked out, that kind of stuff. And that's why I think it's important for the metaverse, because that is, if it's going to have its own internal economy and people are going to have agency, then you can't do that with a Mark Zuckerberg-like figure at the top of it all who has complete godlike powers.
Right. Well, we are just about out of time as well. And Dr. Keir, we would like to really thank you again. This is, I believe, your third session with Unit Masters in the course of 1.5 years. In fact, when I was a participant, my first session, I remember the walk in the woods, and hopefully the participants will get to see that live again in the future. And thank you for taking the time and all the insights for all our participants of Unit Masters again. And would like to wish you the best in all your endeavors, sir.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm sorry that I didn't do this one walking through the woods, but minus 10 degrees and 0.5 meter of snow, that's a bit too much for me. So.
We had your video, the small snippet that you shared for the participants. We did share that with our participants, so they did get a glimpse. Hopefully next time it'll be the walk in the woods again.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me, and good luck, everyone. Hope you've learned something.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.